Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've seen a lot of protests recently against either GM or even the state government in Ohio as to whether or not they should offer tax breaks to corporations. I don't think that they should. This House would prohibit provincial and local governments from offering tax incentives to lure corporations to open business in their domain. I think that model is straightforward. We just don't think local governments should be able to do it, and that's in the form of usually cash rewards and tax breaks is what is usually afforded to companies to have them stay. Usually these companies tend to be automotive plants like GM, Chrysler, etc., but also San Francisco did that to Twitter, so we're actually talking about a wide different variety of businesses. We have two reasons for why we should do this. First of all, we don't think that it's actually good for the communities. And secondly, we think that governments ought not use tax money to cede control to an actor that isn't responsible to that community and where there's no determined benefits anyway. So first of all, why we don't think it's good for the community? Three reasons. Usually, because in a lot of different cases, the economy becomes actually structured around that corporation. So what that means is, like, in lots of different localities, like if you look at, for example, Janesville in Wisconsin, where they had lots of protests about this, it was about the GM plan because it afforded something like 30% of jobs within a community, even if that was not actually working at the plant. It was tied towards selling those kind of cars or transporting them, etc. What that necessarily means is you have different localities or different towns who are subsidizing a corporation to provide employment within those communities. What that necessarily means is if, for whatever reason, that actor wants to leave, as many corporations are tending to do because employment and labor can be found cheaper elsewhere, particularly within East Asia. In those particular scenarios, what you do have is communities making investments in terms of the structure of their employment and the traits that are being afforded to the people inside their communities, never being diversified, instead of being structured around an actor that they don't really have control over. But secondly also, it means that communities become beholden to the wishes of their companies. So it's actually very hard to make a determined contract right at the beginning of this type of relationship. So what it means is that I can say to a particular company that we will only afford you a certain level of tax break, whether that's 5% or 10%. But the point where they employ so much of the populace within a particular locality, they can always try and force renegotiations because at that point there is a certain level of dependency that exists within the relationship. What that necessarily means is that it's actually very, very hard for communities or localities to create some sort of contract that will continue to exist, because even if it's the case where they have that contract, it does mean that it forces companies, or companies can be able to request even additional benefits to that contract, even if they were included.
Okay.
And yeah, sure.
Yeah, so even if all of this stuff about contracts was true, there are some communities right now, like in Oregon, that have rates of 20% unemployment that would love to be structured around a corporation because it would just mean that they have jobs. Why would you put those people in a straitjacket and prevent them from some kind of economic access?
Okay, so I think in those particular areas, job employment obviously should come. I don't think that it's actually beneficial for those communities to be able to do it and use taxpayer money to cede control to an actor that they don't actually have control over. Because what we have seen massive job losses from is corporations just shutting their accounts in different communities and providing that absolute loss of jobs. Emma and I think that obviously communities should work towards creating jobs, but it's not a binary between creating jobs through these companies or not at all. It's about how you want to use money to be able to create jobs, and especially offering these tax incentives to corporations that are not beholden to the interests of communities often can find cheaper labor elsewhere. They actually provide a huge security risk to communities. And thirdly, it's considered basically in this particular scenario kind of like a loan. You are actually just giving money up to a company, like pretty upfront, with no actual security as to how much employment they're going to keep providing. So whether or not James wants to say, well, look, right now we need jobs, there has to be some level of job security that companies or that municipalities should want. And in this particular scenario, what you can do is provide maybe 20,000 jobs at once for one particular moment. That doesn't mean that it sustains at all in the future. So it's basically a huge risk for what is a huge loan. Also, in this particular kind of system, it makes other communities have to do it by the fact that other communities are going to do it. So what that necessarily means is even if you are the municipality that doesn't want to cede control over your tax money, insofar as other cities are doing it and companies are saying, well, we would probably move to you, but you don't provide us any other incentives to do it, it actually makes municipalities beholden to the wishes of other municipalities, meaning that they lose control on that respect as well. The second argument is that this gives actually using tax money to completely lose control over the taxpayer dollars, and why that's wrong. So first of all, we think taxpayer money obviously should be representative to the community's interests. Obviously, the whole reason why people pay taxes is to create some sort of benefit to the society around them. It is giving money to be able to create more jobs in that particular case. The problem with this is that there are completely uncertain benefits. What that necessarily means is if companies do want to shut their doors, whether that is because they've gone bankrupt, as is in many of the cases in the United States, or it's because they're going to relocate labor because it's cheaper elsewhere. What that means is that you get a very uncertain benefit for what you are using money for. In the comparative, if you're using money to build highways, to build hospitals, to employ teachers, you do get that certain social benefit where you know absolutely what you are expecting to be offered to this community as part of them in return paying taxes. In this particular situation, you don't get that certain benefit because the money that you are that you're paying is as your control is lost over it. But secondly, I think I'll take you in a moment. What is also important is that the motivation of the actors is completely different. Usually when you use taxpayer money, it is to provide a service for the community, and the actor that you're ceding it to and being the government is to provide the best service for that community. The difference between here is that the corporations themselves aren't necessarily interested in actually benefiting the community. They're interested in making their own money, and often usually to labor's expense. Sure.
Yeah, if you're looking for a certain benefit, what's the certain benefit of having an across-the-board tax policy by the national government always? Like, what's the guaranteed benefit that we always get, and why is the national government not subject to the same dynamics you're discussing at the local level?
Okay, we think that in this particular case, it's, first of all, that it's impossible for state governments to usually predict the benefit that they're going to get, often because the actor that they're dealing with tends to be more powerful in this particular respect. But we also think that at the point where taxpayers are providing that money, that there should be a level of certainty that comes with those kind of investments. So what I mean by that is at least with other kinds of investments in terms of, even if it's job diversity, not in this particular situation, but even if it's creating other jobs, if they are going to be probably more permanent, and we look for the example like teachers and other social service jobs that are like being created as the alternative to these kind of jobs, those are the kind of things that don't go away just because the actor has different motivations. In those particular cases, we actually think it's better in the comparative to create those kinds of jobs. The real reason is that because governments are supposed to be responsible in terms of their taxpayers' dollars to the people, you're actually ceding it to corporations that have a lot of different motivations to screw over these communities. That's why I'm going to propose.
Okay. I thank the speaker for her remarks, and I invite the leader of the opposition to open the debate to the opposition bench. Hear, hear.
Providing tax incentives is one of the tools in the toolbox that dying cities and others can use to stay competitive and make sure they're ensuring jobs in their community. I'm going to talk to you about three things. First, I'm going to say why having the right over their tax policy and to give this is a democratic right that we think is protected on the local populace. Second, we're going to talk about the fiscal implications of these policies, both how often it's net positive for these communities, and then second of all, how we think in the long run you're raising more revenue by having this than not. And third, we're going to talk about how it can save dying cities and actually help cities go further in the future. Danny is going to talk to you more about how this leads to more insidious competition if it's not over tax revenue, and how other policies get in that are even worse because of this. Before we do that, some specific rebuttal. The top of the case, we're given that this is bad because the entire community will be structured around one corporation and that that'll grow more powerful and can force communities to do bad things. We have four responses. First of all, as was brought up in a POI, you are putting some jobs in communities that are desperate, and so even if you are structured around it, for many communities this is better than having no jobs there in the first place. Second of all, even if it were to be structured around a specific community, remember that you gained tax revenue and gained a lot from having them there in the first place. And usually these cuts are not to zero taxes whatsoever, and even if they are, there are other businesses that are moving in that you're now getting more revenue from secondary benefits. So even if you are later than hurt when they move out, you've gained while they're there. Third, we simply think that it's bad policy to be focused around entirely one corporation and only use this one time. We see many cities that have used this to have startup incubators. Well, they'll have a lot of small companies coming in, hoping that they go up more. You can look at Syracuse that started a startup incubator that has encouraged dozens of companies to move in instead of one big one. And then fourth, we simply say you can use this tactic to diversify. If you're one of these cities that is structured only around the GM plant, use this to bring out in other companies so that you're not structured only around that GM plant. Right? Then we get that there's no security in the future that there'll be jobs provided. We'd say, first of all, you can negotiate this in, right? You can say that your future tax revenue that we'll charge you will be based on the number of jobs you put in. But even if you didn't do that, even if you didn't have the security of jobs in the future tied to tax revenue, we'd say that it's very likely that they're going to stay and provide jobs, right? They have capital expenditure in the area, they've built a factory, they have supply routes established. They may eventually move out, but there are substantial costs to doing so. So we think it's likely that companies will stay for a longer time. Then fourth, they say that if other cities are doing it, you lose the opportunity to control yourself. This like race to the bottom argument. But note that every city that eventually makes a deal is making it under their free will, right? When the others drop out, there's one that says, this deal still benefits my city, and so I am doing well by making this deal. So we don't see why you should be ending that competition when you're simply ending up with better deals for the last city that's staying in. Then second of all, they say that you are ceding control to a corporation that doesn't actually care about your community. We'd say there's two arguments. The first is that often they do care about the community. Once they're put in that neighborhood, they want it to be safe. They want there to be infrastructure because all these things lead to a better workforce for them and better ways that they can make more money. But second of all, we simply think it's, again, a tool in the toolbox. Perhaps directly investing in roads in one case is the best thing for a municipality to do, and it should do that. And in another case, you can build all the roads you want, but if you don't have other jobs in the community, that community is going to die, and that's when we move into these sort of tactics. Go ahead.
Given that lots of the conflicts between laborers and companies focus on things like union rights or wage employment, why do you think these corporations would obviously benefit their workers?
Sure. So obviously, sometimes corporations and workers are at odds, but often they're together, right? You want a community that has thriving businesses because then you hire more people, wages go up, and the businesses do better. So yes, you'll have disputes over labor, but you'll also have things like we want more infrastructure so that we can have better communities and better jobs going forward, right? Why do we think it's a democratic right of these communities? We think that the right to choose your tax policy is an extension of your property right? That you have some control over what you put your labor in and what you've chosen to go forward. Now we realize that this is not an absolute right, and that taxation and other things step in and violate your property rights. But in those cases, we give you a somewhat collective control over that right. So you have tax policy, but you also get representation through your collective body to set what your tax policy is going forward. And this is why we allow different states to have different policies when it comes to personal income tax. They all set different rates as to what's going forward. Some, like Texas and New Hampshire, have no income tax whatsoever. So we say it's also fine for these states to set their own corporate taxes and set their own corporate rates going forward. We don't see why the federal government, a body that you have much less representation in, and as a community you don't entirely control, can come in and say what you as a community can do with your property and you as a tax rate by limiting exactly how you can tax and what you can going forward. We think the right to property protects this.
Do you think that there's a point at which corporate taxes, state level, become excessively low?
Yeah, I do think it's possible to set your tax rate at 0 across the board, and that would probably be bad entirely, right? But we think that each of these states, is making a choice, right? And what's going on here, and I'll go into my next argument, you're making more targeted choices than if you were to put it at 0 totally across the board, right? So let's talk about the fiscal implications of making this deal, right? First, remember that those that are choosing to do this are doing because they think it's a net positive to their community. So even if they were zeroing out to 0 on the industry they're bringing in, they are having many secondary benefits by bringing in new industry. So often these tax breaks apply to film companies. And why is that? Because if you have a major feature film in your area, you have growth in catering, you have growth in construction, you have growth in security, in hotels, and later tourism that's coming to that area. All of these later benefits, those corporations are paying taxes and benefiting your community overall. So that these communities are benefiting from this deal. But second of all, we'd simply say it's a more targeted way to raise revenue. By allowing specific tax breaks to specific corporations, you can compete while keeping the rest of your tax rates at a higher level and making sure you're keeping revenue in. The only other way to compete would be to lower your entire corporate tax rate that applies to everyone in order to compete with other states to incentivize businesses to move in. That broad-based approach is going to hurt your fiscal. You're still going to have the competition, but your fiscal situation is going to be hurt much more than when you can target it. Lastly, why do we think this can save dying cities? Note that we'd love for every city and municipality to invest in schools and to build jobs in all the traditional ways that we think of. But that takes time and that takes money, and not every city has that. And so by investing in things such as startup incubators that Syracuse has done by giving free office space to businesses that move in, or Holyoke has done by saying there are no property taxes for any new business that invests in that community, you can start to get the revenue that can later let you choose to build roads and build schools and do the other ways there are to raising jobs. But often cities have no choice. Their last option is to make this deal that in the short term might not be the best for them, but is a net positive by bringing in secondary business and by starting the chain of growth that will lead that city out of the depressing state it's in. So because it's a democratic right, because the fiscal implications are good, and because it can save dying cities, we're very proud to oppose.
Here. I thank the Speaker for his remarks, and I invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the debate for the government bench. Here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think it's extremely interesting that a lot of the rhetoric we just got from the first opposition speaker was about the rhetoric of choice, and that this is a free democratic right, and that cities ought to have this tool in the toolbox in order to do what's in their best interest. I think what Sarah brings to you in PMC is that it is particularly problematic when some cities use this tactic because it limits the choice and the ability of other cities to not make that choice, right? Yes, in response to James's POI about Oregon and how they really want jobs, yeah, sure, maybe it is good in the short term for Oregon, but it may be tying people's hands in the state of Ohio where they're going to lose jobs because the jobs are going to go to Oregon. So I actually think that from on a national level and in terms of a broad public policy that this ends up being a massive detriment to the states. I think that when you look at organizations that have sought to address this problem in the past, like the Governors Association, governors of states that have lost out as a result of these particular kinds of politics often want to limit the ability of municipalities to give tax breaks to companies, but states that are doing okay in the short term, like particularly states in the southern parts of the United States, don't want to put those restrictions in place. That means that parts of the United States that don't have the political or social or economic capital to really engage in free negotiations with the kinds of businesses that we're talking about are losing out at the end of the day. So in this speech, I'm going to be doing a lot of extensive reputations of what we just heard from opposition before I rebuild what Sarah told you. So let's get into it. Right. So the first thing we hear is that this is making a deal freely and in competition with other jurisdictions, and that because this is like a choice and because it's a free negotiation, that this is in some way fair. So I actually think that the ways in which these deals often go down are extremely problematic and make it really difficult to track what exactly the net benefits are accruing to that particular state. So particularly because these benefits can happen on a municipal level or all the way up to a state or provincial level, it's really hard to figure out exactly how many taxes or tax breaks are being given to these corporations. It's actually very difficult to measure what the net benefit this company is accruing overall. Furthermore, I would say that the negotiating tools and the power afforded to companies like Shell when they enter into these negotiations is really different than like some of these small, struggling, dying cities and towns that First Opposition wants to talk about. I think that if you're a dying city and town and Shell comes to you with a deal that's probably coercive and may lead to long-term structural unemployment, you might take that deal and it may be good in your immediate future. But I actually think that the long-term implications, which are things that public officials and state officials in particular are charged with considering, are things that have to go out the window in light of those particular negotiations. So I think that that's hugely problematic. We also got this, like, often these companies do care, and that they, like, invest in their communities, and that's a good thing. The problem with these kinds of deals is that those officials, these state officials, these government officials, have to take those corporations at their word, and there's no way to ensure that they don't go back and renege on those deals. If you look at the GM plant closings in 2009, 50 of the plants that were closed in towns, cities, and states where they had been assured by GM that they weren't going to be closing because of tax incentives and tax breaks that had been given to those particular corporations. I think that that's hugely problematic. At the point where these companies do sometimes pick up and move out, that town or city or state or province or whatever that gave out those tax breaks in the first point has no recourse to justice or no recourse to the loss that they're incurring at that point. So I think that that is hugely problematic. We also, I think that the discussion about union and wage labor got a little bit oversimplified in the last speech, because I actually think like we don't want to just trust that these corporations are going to do the right thing. And I also don't think that it puts the government, like the kinds of government officials that we're talking about, in a particularly good spot, because we believe on our side of the house that the government ought to be negotiating in the interest of the taxpayers. Those would be the workers. We think that often governments get behind things like wage negotiations and union contracts, and that's a good thing, and that you hamstring their ability to engage in those negotiations at the point where the local government is indebted to the corporation that's providing those jobs. We think that that is like a huge, massive harm to discourse that occurs on their side of the house. We hear that sometimes that you can use taxes to diversify and that can be a good thing. I actually think that in a lot of the cases that we're talking about, particularly in the cases of dying towns and cities, that they're not interested in diversification. They are looking for a quick fix, and that leads to long-term structural unemployment we talked about. Sure.
Okay, where does this unbridled faith in the federal system and its ability to adjudicate complex questions for millions of people in diverse communities come from? Why is the exclusive decision-making power lying in their hands beneficial for the public good, given the track record of Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, so I think like sometimes the federal government does things that limits confidence in their abilities to do things. But I actually think the reason why we want to empower them in this particular instance is because by having no restrictions and having no limitations, state officials that are charged with an obligation to taxpayers, right, like that is actually what the democratic responsibility is here, are completely hamstrung in their ability to engage in negotiations, right? So we actually think that by creating a free and leveling the playing field, even the power differentials in this case, that we're creating better outcomes for taxpayers. So we also hear that sometimes in choosing to do this, communities receive secondary benefits, and we heard a lot about like the film industry in particular, and why sometimes the accompanying economy that grows up beyond film is a good thing. So I actually think film is a particularly interesting example that directly responds to something that Sarah talks about in her Prime Minister's address. Sarah points out that it's really difficult to measure whether or not the job creation that you see as a result of tax incentives would have occurred in the absence of those incentives at all. So it's very difficult to determine whether or not there is actually any measurable benefit here. Sarah also tells you that sometimes, because these tax incentives are effectively amounted to a loan, when you're looking at something like film, which can be rather unstable, the taxpayers often lose out at great expense and then have no recourse to their local officials. So I give you the example of Curt Schilling, the Red Sox player, wanted to open up a film studio in the state of Rhode Island. Rhode Island offered him a lot of tax breaks in order to open up that film studio. The studio collapsed before it ever produced a film. And then the state of Rhode Island and all the taxpayers were on the hook for what was effectively a loan for a business that went nowhere. We think that that is hugely problematic. If you look at the state of New York, which offers all of the tax, more tax benefits to film than a lot of other states, the amount of money that they spend on film per year is the equivalent of hiring and paying for 5,000 public school teachers every year. That is a measurable impact that the government can seek to address. We actually think that those kinds of hiring decisions are much better than these risky gambles at the expense of taxpayers who have no recourse. Okay, so the stuff about dying cities, I think that what's good for one dying city can be particularly problematic for another dying city. I think at the point at which we think that this broad principle helps to protect those towns whose interests may be in conflict with one another, we actually have a policy that is better for more dying cities rather than just empowering one dying city at the expense of another, which I think is what happens on opposition side of things. So what have we given to you today? I think we've talked to you extensively about why this is not particularly good for communities and why this is not consistent with a democratic or free choice that opposition wants to have you believe. I think we've talked to you about why this is a very damaging and dangerous tool in the toolbox that these governments aren't able to enter into freely. And then Sarah talked to you extensively about why governments shouldn't lose control over taxpayer dollars and why taxpayer dollars should be used to directly benefit the taxpayer. For all those reasons, we're very proud to join up.
I thank the speaker for her remarks. Before I call upon the next speaker, just a reminder to please keep the chatter at a low volume so that it doesn't interfere with our ability to hear these beautiful speeches. With that, I call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the debate for the opposition bench. Hear, hear.
What I want to talk to you about today is our belief that the alternative to tax breaks is far worse. Because even if you buy the analysis coming out of open government, that this creates competition between states, we think it's a system of competition in which all localities can compete fairly, and it is a system where the consequences of that competition is far better than the consequences of alternative sources of competition to lure these businesses to dying towns and cities. But before I do that, specific areas of rebuttal. So first, we hear repeated out of the last speaker this idea that it's a detriment to states. Oregon's gain is essentially Washington's loss. So we have a few responses. First, we'd say it oftentimes isn't the choice between Oregon or Washington. It's the decision to whether or not you stay in the United States or locate abroad. Take, for example, three recent closings of major manufacturing in the United States. A Domino sugar plant in Baltimore, a Carrier plant in Syracuse, and a Rubbermaid plant in Worcester, Ohio. In each of those instances, the choice was to relocate those facilities between staying in the United States and going abroad to Asia where labor was cheaper. they ended up going abroad. We think in this instance it would be far better to keep those jobs in the United States than it would be to send them overseas. We think tax breaks is an important way towns and states are able to do that. But second, we point out that the nature of development is often zero-sum, in the sense that when we're deciding whether or not to open a plant in a new location, of course choosing to open it in Washington is going to mean that you don't have jobs in Oregon. We think it's nonsensical to say like we can't possibly allow this like to take place. We think it's going to happen. We're willing to say that that's a legitimate harm in this instance. Then she points out like Shell will offer will get sweetheart deals from towns. We think what will happen in a world in which towns aren't able to offer Shell, say, a tax break to go ahead and open up a refining facility, is that they're going to offer alternative forms, like say, we're willing to open state conservation land to you so that you can drill and explore for more resources. We're going to lower safety standards for you. We're going to basically get out of your hair and let you run your business. We think that's far worse than just offering a company a tax break. Then she says like, oh, GM lied and closed a bunch of plants in 2009. Well, we point out that's in the midst of the financial crisis. GM's decision to close was based on markets collapsing, which no one foresaw. Then we'd like to point out that she doesn't have any responses to Alex's analysis where he talks about collective property rights and how it's essentially the right of the community to go ahead and take these actions and decide if they want to offer specific companies a better break. And then finally, like she says, it's hard to determine whether or not films are actually helping communities. We'd say no, in this instance, it's pretty clear. Having a film be made in your city is bringing in jobs. Why? Because if you didn't have that film, you weren't going to have people staying in those hotel rooms. You weren't going to employ those construction workers and electricians to go ahead and wire the set. You weren't going to have the publicity where you see great shots of Boston in movies like The Departed and The Town and make people want to go visit that great, wonderful city. But okay, on to my own subject.
Before you go
sure.
If you say that it's more problematic that states compete on the basis of things like opening up conservation land, do you then support prohibiting states from competing on that basis, so states can't offer conservation land to attract businesses?
So I think that's another debate, but I think what's important here is that I would rather states compete in a system of tax breaks, and I think that's what we have now, and that's what I'm trying to maintain. So okay, I think it's pretty clear that politicians have the responsibility and are pressured to bring jobs to their community or to keep jobs there. What that means is that they can't use the tool of tax breaks, they're going to try and use some other tactic. And we can point out 5 strategies, no thank you, that states already employ that we think they're going to use more often if we go ahead and remove the tool of tax breaks. So the first and perhaps most problematic is we think there will be a general crackdown on things like unions and employee rights. Why? Because oftentimes the most expensive part of opening a plant is actually labor. So companies are very sensitive to labor costs. And if states can't offer a break on taxes, they're going to try and offer a break on labor. So how are they going to do this? They're going to pass things like right-to-work laws, which prohibit unions from actually gaining a foothold in a state. They're going to go ahead and lower things like health standards and benefits that are required by companies to offer. We think this is far worse. It's going to mean that while there might be jobs located in the state, those jobs often pay less, those workers have less protection, and as a whole, organized labor and the prosperity of America is threatened. We'd like to point out like Alabama and Tennessee, which are actually the states where most car companies are opening facilities. And Alabama actually now produces more cars than the state of Michigan. Now Michigan has been willing to offer tax breaks, but it can't possibly compete in a system where Alabama is able to manipulate the alternative, which is to pass things like right-to-work laws. We think if Michigan wasn't able to offer tax breaks, you'd see far more Big 3 plants opening up in the South than you see now. The only reason the UAW in Michigan is staying in business is because of things like offering tax breaks. But second, we think we're forced to lower all taxes in general, right? Rather than targeting a specific tax break to get a car company to open in your state, you have to lower all corporations' taxes. And while, yeah, that might be great that we have lower taxes, it forces us to do things like trade-off in services and force already dying cities to go into massive deficit. We think that's a system which simply isn't economically sustainable. We think it's far worse on the long run welfare and prosperity of cities. Third, we think they're forced to offer sweetheart deals and contracts, where they basically give explicit deals to companies in exchange for them agreeing to open offices in their state. So take, for example, Rhode Island and G-Tech, which is a gaming company, that in exchange for running Rhode Island's lottery and getting a portion of the cut from that, agreed to open its new headquarters in Providence. We think that's a system where the state loses out far more than if it were to stay, instead, offer a tax break. Fourth, we think we lead to things like political manipulation. So we do things like you use Congress and your local and your senators to try and get companies to open offices in your state. Take, for example, Trent Lott, the former Senate Majority Leader from the state of Mississippi, who went ahead and used his clout in Congress to convince Lockheed Martin to open the manufacturing facility for for the new F-35 within the state of Mississippi. We think a system like that is far more likely to occur in an instance where you don't allow states to use tax breaks, which is simply unfair because certain cities and states don't have the power to do that, and we think it breeds corruption. But finally, we think it forces governments to actually go ahead and invest in companies directly. And we think it's interesting she mentions Curt Schilling and 38 Studios, because what actually happened in that instance was the state of Rhode Island bought stock into the company in order to get Curt Schilling to go ahead and open up Operations Rhode Island. And why is that problematic? Because now the state of Rhode Island is basically holding millions of dollars in stock in a company that is absolutely worthless. We don't think states should invest directly in businesses. We think that creates a system where taxpayers are far more likely to lose out. Yes, we think we have competition in this system, but we think it's a system of competition in which all states are able to compete on a fair and even playing field. We think a system of alternatives where states are forced to do things like attack unions and lower standards and environmental qualities. We think that's far worse. We'd rather states compete on the basis of tax breaks because at the end of the day, they are going to compete. So that's what we're evaluating in this debate. Which system is a better form of competition? For that reason, we probably
There. I thank the speaker for his remarks, and I invite the member of government to continue the debate for the government bench. Here.
We think that ultimately competition through tax incentives is bad for these local governments and citizens because of three reasons. Firstly, we think that these incentives, what this policy does is that it makes it harder for governments to have incentives to have policies that create real value and long-term growth. Secondly, what we argue is that what their policy does is that it contradicts federal policy, and what we do is try to make local and provincial governments act in a way that does not hurt the economic master plans that the federal government has in place. And thirdly, what we want to extend on is the idea that what competition through tax incentive does is that it takes away flexibility that local and provincial governments need to make sure that all sectors of society are well taken care of. So, rebuttals will be done throughout. So firstly, let's talk about how can we incentivize politicians and these governments to create real value. Because in their argument about how there are situations when you balance harms when it comes to things like labor unions and ensuring labor unions are not unnecessarily affected by this sort of policies, it is a concession that creating jobs is not the be-all and end-all of economic policy. This means that we need to take into consideration something more than that, right? We want to create more value. And the reality is that their argument throughout the two speakers was that the reason why we want them to be there is that, well, they can create jobs which will somehow magically make sure that there will be long-term growth in that particular local province. We don't think they've shown that. Maybe closing will do that. But what we say is that what more often than not happens is that these companies are usually there because of these tax incentives and only because of this tax incentive, rather than any real value that's being generated by these local governments. In fact, members of this House, what we say is that it makes it even harder for these governments to want to, these local governments to invest in infrastructure, to invest in education, because they have less tax revenue to work with in the first place. And what we argue is that this is detrimental for these governments in the long run, because they are stymied by the fact that they are beholden to these tax incentives that need to be there in order for these companies to stay there. Secondly, what we say is, in fact, in response to the first speaker, no thank you, in response to the first speaker, that it's in fact important for these dying cities to not have this policy of competing through tax incentives. Because the reality is that these dying cities are dying because they have problems in terms of infrastructure, they have problems with regards to an uneducated workforce. The workforce is structurally unable to take on the jobs that the market demands right now. So what we argue is that when they play the tax break game, it makes it even harder for them to create a sort of real growth and infrastructure change that is required for them to take on the economy of the future. And what we argue then is that it makes it a lot harder for them to have incentives to create the real kinds of change that we want to see in our side of the house. Why is it then that they are reluctant to have all these policies? Because what we argue on our side, which is something unique to us, is that local politicians make stinky deals with these corporations because of electoral incentives, right? Why is this so? The reality is that local businesses, I'll take you in a moment, local politicians are likely to be more pro-business, right? Because in the local elections, they do not want to be seen as the one who drove the businesses away. They want to be seen as the job creator because that's more immediately tangible to the voter, right? But the problem with that is that the long-term harm of that is not apparent to the voter. After your two-year term, what more often what happens is that you often can blame it on something else. On the opposite end, members of this house, what we say is that when it comes to these long-term policies of education infrastructure, the benefits are not immediate, which makes it such that local politicians are more reluctant to adopt this policy because they can't trumpet it as a real tangible gain. What we argue, members of this house, is that the existence of tax incentives makes it such that they want to compete on these more immediate gains rather than these long-term gains that are more beneficial for those communities. I'll take closing.
Thank you. Yeah, so sometimes constituents are going to want better job protection. Sometimes constituents are going to want more jobs. They have diverse interests. Who's more responsive to those interests? A federal government that's thousands of miles away and insulated by lobbyists that are preparing the legislation, or people who are actually determining who's elected on the ground level?
We think at the end of the day, and I'll get onto this later on my point in my argument, is that the federal government has an economic master plan, that there are strategies that are ongoing at the federal level in order to ensure that each province is able to take advantage of their comparative advantage, right? So when we talk about issues like opening up conservation land, we think that in fact that's a good thing, that in fact that's something they must do because it is their inherent comparative advantage they're not taking advantage of, right? What we argue is that taking away this ability to compete via tax incentives makes them want to create more value through things that they are inherent strengths. So what we say is that this allows, this creates incentives for these governments to do so. Which brings me, and this brings me nicely on to my second argument, right? About how there's a need to ensure that local and provincial governments do not contradict federal economic policy. This deals with the argument about how these local provinces have a democratic right to do whatever they want with their budget, right? Because what we argue is that when their actions hurt other states, when their actions themselves create a race to the bottom whereby other states are forced to have even lower taxes in order to compete in a market where the equilibrium is brought lower and lower by this vicious cycle, we say that that's where the state can say, you know what, you do not have this autonomy, we are able to say that the federal government can step in to intervene, right? And this is what we saw in Obamacare, right? Where individuals who have an individual's ability to not want to take insurance, right, affects other people, which is why we can mandate that you make sure that you get insurance, right? And and therefore it is clear that when the signals are problematic, we need to make sure that there are tax incentives are not there, opening.
How does cracking down on unions and the health benefits of employees, which is the primary way that governments are trying to do this, actually create long-term value?
So what you argued in your substantive was that, well, this will make governments want to concede other things that may hurt people even more, right? We say that in the long run, our policy is better. Because in your case, members of this house, the moment they can't compete on tax incentives, when they are as low as they can be and when the budget can no longer support these tax incentives, what they're going to do is they are still going to concede these benefits anyway. So we say that in your situation, it's going to be a lot worse. And let me touch briefly on to my third extension, right? Which is the idea that you take away the flexibility that these local autonomous governments have to deal with the social problems in their society, right? Because beyond creating jobs and making sure that the economy does well, you need to take care of the lowest common denominator, the people who are at the bottom end. We say that the moment you take away the tax, make it such that they compete on tax incentives and take away their tax revenue, what happens is that these governments makes it harder for these local politicians to take it away, right? Because they will be labeled as a job killer the moment they try to raise taxes to generate revenue to help the poor. So we say, members of this house, this is very it harms the local politicians' their ability to deal with the budget flexibly. So because of these three reasons, firstly, creating low value, secondly, not contradicting federal economic policy, and thirdly, giving flexibility to local politicians, this motion must stand.
Okay. I thank the Speaker for his remarks, and I invite the member of the opposition to continue the debate to the opposition bench. Here.
So I think this has been a good debate so far, but what's fundamentally missing is a weighing of why federal policy would be good or bad. And that's why I'm pleased that this begins to come out in the closing government. We hear a lot of good things from the opening opposition, which I'd like to flag quickly about how incubator and startup companies, diversification, or collective property rights, as well as how the alternative might be a decline of things like unions or employee rights. But what I would like to directly clash with the previous speaker on the question of is why the master plan, so to speak, is bad. We think that standardized tax policy is ultimately totally bankrupt at the federal level. We think that federal decision-making is ultimately more liable to be corrupt. And I want to outline that. Afterwards, I'll talk about sort of a value-based point about why we think there should be localized policy writ large, why that's better, and then more like clash with the concrete examples, questions of praxis. My refutation of the previous speaker will largely be embedded, but I'll make it more explicit at the very end of the speech. So initially, we think sort of federal oversight of tax policy is something that is ultimately more corrupt and worse off for the local constituents. There's actually no local constituents. They're fundamentally distanced from those local populations. This means that they're structurally formed to account for disparate resources across a whole nation as opposed to localized resources. They also have a lack of respect for the public good. The people who are in power within places like Washington, D.C. are dictated by seniority and appropriation committees, things like that. Per capita infrastructure and spending for Alaska, for example, between 1970 and 2010 was over 10 times higher than a state like California. Now, why would that be? It's because of former Senator Ted Stevens, right? He's not tied to the Alaskan population. The impact of this is that there's a new exclusively federal tax standard that's determined by politically idiosyncratic and arbitrary factors, such as which state is represented by a geriatric like Ted Stevens. Another impact is that the federal process is ultimately worse at localized decision making. But there's another way to approach this problem that is briefer and short. Think about what we're here concerning how corporations can have sort of their hands in the pockets of local governments. Think about what it takes to be elected within Washington, D.C. You're dealing with corporations that have more power in lobbies. And the reason for this is because to become a federal official, it is fundamentally more expensive, inherently more expensive. The process of raising that capital means that being a federal official means you have more corporate lobbies in your pockets, so to speak. Local officials are tied more to local businesses, which is why they have more contextualized policy and why that's better. Real quick, to engage the previous speaker, in just 1 second I'll take you, the example that we heard was Obamacare, which if there was a master plan, which I think is pretty contentious, it was clearly a policy that was written by health insurance companies, by pharmaceutical companies. It has no sort of ground level engagement with the individual states that we're talking about. This is sort of reductio ad absurdum that is a counterexample against your case of a policy that is a one-size-fits-all, top-down solution that is bad for local companies and things like that. Please.
Corporate interest at the national level is checked by the ability of individual voters to donate to the politicians to counter those effects. At the local level, businesses very easily dominate these elections with their overwhelming ability and disproportionate ability to fund these local elections. Which do you think is better then?
I think that's absurd. Like, my ability to donate money to Ted Stevens, for example, is minuscule by comparison to what he got from oil companies, right? Like, what can I do to counterbalance pharmaceutical companies, right? Those lobbies are fundamentally more powerful at a federal level. But I want to flag a certain value in this debate, and we think that is subsidiarity. The condition for freedom within governance writ large requires a checks against centralization of power. Now, there are some areas in which centralization is necessary, things like national defense, for example. But as a general principle, we should drive down governance to the lowest levels possible, and that means local governments, right? We think that not only does this have like sort of abstract values of increased participation, but it also more concrete instances of localized contextualization of policies. That decreases the amount of disenfranchisement of individual states, and it also checks back against one-size-fits-all solutions. That's the sort of value that we hold in this debate. I'm going to go through more practical examples that answers the sort of perverse incentive line of argumentation. That's all we've gotten from the government in this debate. Before I do that, please.
Which is better, a tax incentive or tax policy created based on a federal economic strategy, or one that is coerced by the fact that other states have a lower tax rate than you?
I don't think there's that sort of competition, but more importantly, the point is the master plan is driven more by corporations than the local government officials who require less capital in order to gain office. I already answered this argument. So I want to deal with the perverse incentives line of analysis that the government seems to have gone all in on. Local governments have a unique incentive to respond to local constituencies which federal officials don't have. I think I explained that in my initial shift on why federal tax policy was a net worth. But you should also note that where these officials choose to allow corporations to enter into their local population, it's because they've engaged in a weighing. Their constituents say something like, Walmart, probably shitty, but we have no jobs, and we're going to take the bullet on that question. Right? If the race to the bottom were true, then it could happen at a national level, right? It would cause corporations to flee from whole countries that have things like labor standards or tax standards at all into other countries. That would not only cause our impacts of the sort of disenfranchisement or detachment from local government, but it would also cause their impacts. It would compound the two of them. But you should simply know that this is empirically denied. You look at states like California, New Jersey, New York, Illinois. They have the most taxes and also the most businesses, right? There's not a lowest level of businesses there. If they were right on their side of the debate, South Dakota, Arkansas, and Nevada would have more businesses than any of these states that don't, right? right? Like California has a higher tax policy and has more business. But let's not speak in such negative terms because it's not really good for one's ethos, right? Here's a concrete positive example that my friend from Oregon will like to harp on. In Oregon, there's a 20% unemployment. Why is that? Because they're largely dependent on a timber industry. What does that mean? Well, it means when the housing market collapses and you don't need timber to build houses, that you lose all your jobs. So we're experiencing 20% unemployment throughout Oregon. We need contextualized incentives within Oregon to do things like increase housing production or to get alternative corporations into Oregon in order to keep the state afloat. What they'll tell you is that, oh, well, local people can generate revenue. No, they have one resource that the federal government does not take into consideration with their supposed master plan. We think you also have states such as South Dakota that can't get corporations in there. They lack things like a cosmopolitan area or basic resources. Sorry if anyone's from South Dakota. But contrary to opening government, there aren't these sort of nomadic corporations that roll in, that like set up a Walmart and then move on after a couple months. They invest in those areas. They're not going somewhere later. It's hard to move your Walmart. It's not on wheels. Right? The alternative is, or rather the choice, is not between local corporations that can give you puppies and kittens and then the evil corporations. It's between some jobs and nothing whatsoever. So we hear that there's a sort of a destruction of local governments, but we think that money is a prerequisite to things like infrastructure, right? And we've already argued that local officials are better than federal officials. We heard that it haunts the master plan, but there's no reductio ad absurdum of a 0% tax policy. But the master plan is bad. We think local officials are better than federal officials on the question of tax policy. So we oppose.
Yeah. I thank the Speaker for his remarks, and I invite the Government Whip to close out the debate for the Government bench here.
Two questions. One, are state officials in the best position to decide policy? And when we decide the tax breaks that offer these corporations, are they actually acting and responsive to the interests of the constituents? Comparison to federal level, which is material that came out from Canada wasn't really responded to, and also directly responds to material coming out from the closing side. Second, on the comparative, does tax breaks actually offer more benefits than harms? And how does it compare to the other alternatives the states engage with? First question. What we hear from the closing side is arguments about how the federal government is broken. That basically that corporations have immense power within the federal government. What we don't hear are arguments about why state governments are immune from corporate pressure. What we don't hear are arguments about why state governments are not more vulnerable to corporate pressure. Arguments that Kenneth told you when he told you about how corporations have disproportionate lobbying power within the local government, and disproportionate influence the local government, because local officials need to present themselves in a certain way as job creators. And that's often a metric, and that's often we think that they can present immediately to the public, even if there are long-term costs, even if there are long-term harms. But more importantly, we think that the argument that they make presumes two things. It presumes one, that autonomy exists within the state government to decide these particular policies. It also presumes that governments in this context are responding to local interests, right? We don't think these are true. We don't think this is true precisely because we think that in the state context, corporations have greater ability to fund these individuals as compared to local citizens. So we're talking about state races, for example, talking about national races, right? Individuals are able to donate this in a way that can counterbalance the might of corporations. That's how Barack Obama was able to go against the Republican Party machine, because he relied on donations by many small-time democratic donors, right? But in the state, local context, the individuals within the provincial governments, within municipal governments, don't have the ability, even if they all donated, to counteract the influence of these corporations. But second, we think that often these politicians are far more responsive to the demands of these corporations. They're far more responsive to the needs of these corporations as opposed to the needs of constituents. Because the corporations can easily pressure these politicians to tell them that if you don't offer us these tax breaks, we're going to move away. They can easily threaten them with to fund acts that go against these particular individuals, right? I think it's more pernicious, and in fact the corporate interests are more harmful within the federal level. Second, Second response to this is to say that often on the federal level, right, the ability of corporations to influence policy, to influence things like tax breaks, are counterbalanced by other agencies. Like for example, the media attention is usually more focused on what's happening on the national level, right? You have other interest groups, other like think tanks or other big unions like AFL-CIO, which tend to focus their energies also on the federal level, because that's where most of the attention takes place, most of the drama takes place. What goes under the radar, where corporations have the most power, is in fact in state races, right, where there's less media attention, where local newspapers are often gutted by like falling revenues, where there's no ability to focus on these things, where organizations like AFL-CIO, which have limited organizational capacity, don't have the ability to organize in those areas. We think that states are often worse than federal. Closing.
Local governance has an incentive to pay attention to their local constituency. Why would the federal government have a reciprocal incentive?
Look, if we're going to talk to you, look, we think that federal governments do have ability, do need to be responsive to local constituencies, right? Because these are still people who vote them in. But what we say today is we call a comparative in terms of the influence of corporate money and corporate finance between federal government and state governments, which is where the extension comes in. We think that the corporate power in state and local governments are far more pernicious compared to federal government, right? And then, so that deals with the whole idea of autonomy and deals with the whole idea about how you need to allow flexibility. Because what we say here is that state governments are not in fact acting in the interest of the constituents. They're not in fact acting on autonomous level, because they're responding to the pressures that they face from other state governments. So we don't think this argument stands entirely. Let me move on to the comparative, right? Because what we hear from both opening and closing governments, opposition, is that we need this policy to generate growth. We need these policies for tiny cities in order to allow them to gain this particular benefit. And the moment these companies move in, they'll create jobs, they'll have infrastructure, they'll generate value. Three responses. One, we think that we are talking about dying cities, right? We're not talking about New York, California, because these states have huge, immense other powers. We're talking about dying cities, smaller states, poorer states. They often, the reason why they're dying, the reason why they're poor, and this is what Kenneth told you, is often because they have poor infrastructure and uneducated labor force, right? What this means is that you need to offer massive tax breaks in order to attract these corporations. What this means is that the kind of tax breaks that you need to do are often far in excess of the kind of taxes that will actually be imported or able to actually effectively help these states gain revenue, right? Why is this problematic? Because what this means is that this suggests that these corporations don't really care about things like infrastructure and educated workforce, right? Because, look, corporations don't go into the particular area of the goodness of their hearts or because they want to build the infrastructure of their place. They go there because, and corporations are more likely to want to take advantage of existing infrastructure, of existing labor force. For their policy to work for the cities they talk about, these corporations need to be really incentivized or be very sensitive to low taxes. What this suggests is that, one, these corporations will move very easily when other places offer lower taxes, because that's their primary consideration, right? But it also means that, second, the kind of infrastructure, the kind of job that you generate are likely to be short-term, unlikely to be unstable, and we think that makes people worse off. Opening.
Sure. So we believe that tax policy offers the chance to use a scalpel, targeting it around a specific company or time frame. Why isn't that preferable to a hatchet of cutting all employee rights or general taxes in the hope that eventually a company relocates?
On this whole idea of scalpel, this is in fact my second argument, because they say that ultimately other smaller businesses will move in. This we think is pernicious, this we think is insidious. Because what happens here is that you generate and create greater inequality. Because their model suggests that big businesses with the ability to move, big businesses with the ability to transfer capital around, get the tax breaks. Small businesses don't. Small businesses have to pay the burden and bear the burden of paying taxes. We think that means that small business owners, small individuals, small corporations get worse off under their model as compared to ours. But let's go on to the idea of alternatives, right? Because they've argued that, look, like what about all the other things, right? Union busting, for example, which have several responses. One, these things exist under both our models. Unfortunately, it's something we can't fix, but at least we fix an element of this. And we don't think our model excessively encourages states to do this, because we think we also at the same time want to encourage states to do things like invest in infrastructure. But second, we say that in fact, it's better to do things like, for example, correct unions, because when you do things like bus unions or right to work laws, what you're often doing is a restructuring what is an ossified or what is an overly rigid labor force. That's something that creates value, right? When you allow labor and allow worker rights to be better negotiated instead of having unions have over control. Under their model, the only thing that works is tax breaks, which don't create value at all. Finally, Kenneth told you, no response, that what the people who really suffer when you can't get proper tax revenue are the poor, are the people who rely on state services, are the people who rely on things like welfare, like food stamps, who get disproportionately harmed when the state can't balance its budget. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud to propose.
I thank the Speaker for his remarks, and I invite the Opposition Whip to close out today's debate. Hear, hear.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to begin by clarifying the stakes in this debate. Because it's not as though the opposition is saying that unilaterally local governments should entirely take over tax policy of the entire body politic. However, that is the kind of radical approach we get from the government, which is saying that the federal government should be the exclusive domain of decisions with respect to taxes henceforth, that municipalities and local governments ought to have no control over their tax incentive policy. That means that their taxes are either static or they're non-existent and they're all just shifted to the federal level and subsumed within the federal level. Like, that's a very damaging policy. And I think it's clear that this issue breaks down on 3 levels. One, it's a question of whether the federal government is the preferable body to be making decisions of tax incentives, increasing lower business taxes with respect to businesses. There's secondly the question of whether the local government is preferable. And then third, whether or not which is more robust in terms of its consistency with democratic principle. I'm going to go through those one by one. Let me first handle a little bit that we got out of the government whip. So one of the key arguments in response to James' extension is that states are actually more vulnerable to corporate pressure. The reason he gives for this is that Obama was elected by lots of small contributions, and that local officials, because of the way they need to present themselves to their local constituents, need to show themselves as being business people, and so they're like more embedded business. And I just don't think this passes the smell test. First of all, the exorbitant amount of corporate spending and lobbyist spending that takes place for all elections at the federal level is so prohibitively expensive. Precisely. You absolutely have to be in bed with business in order to get to DC. It's incredibly unlikely. I would say impossible to get a job in DC without significant investments from those businesses. And the idea that Obama did not have significant contributions from the financial industry, from corporations and businesses in 2008, 2012 is ludicrous. He had more money than John McCain from those industries in 2008, and he had equivalents or similar amounts of money to Mitt Romney in 2012. So you're just wrong on that, although he did have a lot of independent money too. But secondly, and more importantly, municipal and state officials are immune to a lot of these pressures. Why? Because they participate in elections, in some cases with like several thousand people. That's enough people that you literally, in order to win an election, have to go door to door and shake people's hands and talk to them. That means that you have more immediate pressure from the municipality that you're attempting to govern, and you can't like spoondoggle them, that's not a word, into like thinking that they're not being screwed over by the policies that you're passing. That's not the case from the politically insulated world of Washington, D.C., where incumbency is a huge advantage, and once you're an incumbent, all you need is money to perpetuate your policies and continue to be there. That's just simply inaccurate to say that local officials are more immune or less immune to business pressures than the federal government. Secondly, I just want to handle this idea that they have at the end of social services. They protect social services somehow. Look, if it's the case that you're talking about Oregon, where you need to engage, where there's high rates of unemployment and you don't have revenues because you have no economy in that state, it absolutely is essential if you want to balance your budget. It absolutely is essential if you want to fund social services that you incentivize corporations to create a revenue base for your communities so that you can fund those vital programs. If you don't, you're in a vicious cycle of a lack of economic activity that depletes your resources, depletes your budget, and means that you can't fund things like unemployment for the population that isn't working because you don't have any money because there are no jobs for them to spend things on, so you don't get sales tax revenues. It's just obvious that that's not helpful for balancing the budget. Let's get into, before I do, go ahead.
When local politicians face the prospect of raising taxes and potentially driving businesses away that provides Uncle Joe with a job, they are less likely to do so because it's not good, it's going to hurt that guy.
Yeah, there are lots of different communities, okay? Some communities are made up of bohemian bourgeois people who really hate Walmart, and so they don't let Walmart into their communities, even though that would be cheaper goods. Some communities are made up of communities where they have no jobs, and so they're like, yes, please desperately give me a job. No, I don't care if there's a minimum wage. Communities are very different. To say that every community is going to operate on that one basis and constantly accept this race to the bottom was refuted by James, and I'll respond to that later with the counterfactuals of the fact that there are places where there are lots of businesses that happen to have high tax rates. No, sorry, get to opening in a little bit. Okay, 3 questions. First, the question of federal government. From opening government, we hear in a response to a POI, to my POI, that federal government sometimes isn't ideal, but that's about it. Closing government aggressively advocates the idea that the federal government has a master plan and gives the warrant of Obamacare, which I think is pretty bad because mandating insurance for universal health care is something that the left thought was bad policy, the right thought was bad policy, and premiums are currently going up, businesses are scared to death. Like, it's not a good example of policy that like very clearly is a master plan. If anything, it was like a hodgepodge of like some good intuitions that turned into a really bad thing that everybody's clear on the fact needs to be reformed. Not going to spend more time on that. Okay, but what does James tell you on the federal government? He tells you that the federal decision making is bad for two reasons specifically. One, because corporations have more influence at this level for reasons I've already explained in my rebuttal, and James already explained. But secondly, because the federal government just empirically is bad at this kind of decision making because it doesn't represent the public good being like a good, robust majority of the people within the federal system. Why is that? Because Ted Stevens and things that result from seniority processes allow people like Ted Stevens to siphon off tremendous amounts of resources and so therefore set tax policy in ways that are beneficial to a very small amount of the population. California has a lot more people than Alaska, like by factors of lots of numbers, okay? But they've gotten a lot of money for no other reason than we have an arbitrary and arcane system that grants a lot of power to people like Ted Stevens. That doesn't stop under their side of the house. So you can expect policy to be set that would be good for Alaska and bad for California. That's not a good thing, not this time. Okay, second thing. Question of whether the local system is better. So I think that definitively shows the federal system wouldn't be good. On the local level, we hear a few arguments from opening government. The first is that there's absolutely no benefit to be had. Okay, they drop that and later say that there's no certain benefit to be had. Okay, I think this is obviously like in government in general, you don't get certain benefits. Like when the Obama administration passed the Stimulus Act, they didn't know like for certain it was going to work real good. They just passed it and kind of crossed their fingers. The government's doing this kind of thing a lot of the time. Third, they said that the power asymmetry or like the race to the bottom always means that you get economically coerced contracts. Go ahead.
At the point where you're a politician that's put so much tax money in getting a corporation to come to your community, does that make you more beholden to the corporation when they want to do things like curb union rights or curb employment rates or to the constituency?
If the corporation is violating the rights of a big chunk of the population in a municipality, the government of that municipality is far more likely to react negatively to that corporation's behavior than a federal government policy, which, by the way, as James pointed out, is subject to the same pressures at the international level. Okay? However, what we have is responsive government. What you have is insulated government from these political pressures. On the local level, in terms of the race to the bottom, we gave you the counterfactuals of a lot of states that have tons of business and high taxes at the same time. We pointed out that Walmarts and some businesses simply don't move. We thirdly pointed out this applies again at the international level. In terms of local government, from the closing, I already corresponded to closing government saying the local governments aren't good because of the social services thing. So lastly, let me very briefly talk about the point of democracy. What we told you under the principle of subsidiarity is that it is important for freedom that government always be pushed down to the most local level possible so that you can have genuine participation in politics. We don't centralize for no reason, but government has that instinct. We need to resist that instinct and allow local governments to make local decisions that are responsive to their constituents and responsive to their interests. Right now that doesn't happen at the federal level. We should allow local governments to make these decisions. We're proud to oppose.
Here, here.